Okay, so I'm going to kick off with this quotation, which is from the second stanza of a poem that was published as part of a student magazine at Dundee University in 1905. It was titled "The New Education or Botany" in 1905, which is a pseudonymous poem. You'll see why when we read through it. Because what this poem is it's a parodic poem, where Geddes is the speaker and one of Geddes' students is satirising him and his sort of educational outlook in the poem itself. And again, I should say, very thankful to Matthew Jarron, who published this in his article, "Forget the silly notion that I'm here to teach you botany," which is about Patrick Geddes at University College Dundee. So the stanza reads, "Come all ye products of the schools, on facts and figures fed, on undiluted nature sate your appetites instead. Forget your empty parrot talk, your meaningless verbosity, and let the anise sense of things arouse your curiosity." What we're seeing in this stanza via this parody of Geddes is some of the ideas that Murdo was just articulating on Geddes's frustrations with the way that children, young people, young adults are taught, finding that they are far too often simply regurgitating facts and figures, that too often they are focused on textbook learning, that they are simply being trained to conduct examinations. What Geddes wants to develop instead is an education that is focused on nature learning, focusing on nature, and as we'll see as I go through as well, learning through drama, learning through mural painting, and various other experiences. What this quotation speaks to, I think, though, is the fact that Geddes has these new ideas about how education should be structured and new ideas about childhood. And in that sense, he's very much speaking to his era, which was sort of seen, the late 19th century, seen as an emergence or re-emergence of a focus on the child and childhood. Geddes himself noted that this was a kind of key part of the zeitgeist in the 1890s. He wrote, "For the young giant of Rabelais is stirring among us. The orbis pictus of Comenius anew opens before our eyes. Rousseau's Emile continues his glorious youth, and Pestalozzi's Gertrude is again guiding her children through a larger growth cycle." I should say that's a quotation from his review of G. Stanley Hall's book, Adolescence, which is a very formative text that focuses on the fact that adolescence is sort of the key stage in human development. And Stanley Hall says that actually if the human as a race is to be perfected, we need to focus on that period of adolescence and perfecting it. And then more broadly, in that review as well, Geddes says the child movement has been thoroughly popularised. We can find this in various different forms in Geddes's works. For instance, he was corresponding with Clementina Anstruther-Thompson, who in the early 20th century was involved in the Girl Guides, and he was recommending the magazine Child Study to her, which we can see in this letter, where he says, "On subject of measuring capacity by better than school exams, see Child Study, magazine of the Child Study Society. The time is ripe for that uplift in education which both sides of party politics agree as yet in practically ignoring," which is quite an interesting statement here, and that Geddes is acknowledging that there is this large and broad movement to focus on the child and to develop a more child-centred learning, but he's also acknowledging that nevertheless educational parties and national education is ignoring those developments in that research. We can see through various different efforts that Geddes is involved in this period that he is trying to think of new forms of education that he thinks is more child-centric. We see this, I suppose, in the fact that Geddes and his colleague Victor Branford were very supportive of the Scouting movement, which sort of builds on Clementina Anstruther-Thompson's enthusiasm for the Girl Guides. And one of the things that John Scott and Ray Bromley identify in their book Envisioning Sociology, is the fact that Geddes and Bramford argued that the Scouting movement, quote, in its origin and growth recapitulates with curious fidelity the natural divergences of the primitive hunting life. And this links back to Geddes's ideas that we need to sort of uncover and to preserve those sort of primitive energies and link them into other forms of intellectual curiosity. It's also commented on in that book, Envisioning Sociology, that Bramford and Geddes had, as they write, considerable sympathy with the emerging progressive school movement and the educational ideas of Pestalozzi, Montessori, and Rudolf Steiner. And you can see how some of these thinkers' ideas are reflected in some of Geddes's quotes. For instance, he's quoted as saying that the child's desire of seeing, touching, handling, smelling are all true and healthy hungers, and these should be cultivated. So rather than traditional education in this period that's trying to repress these particular hungers or desires or curiosities, Geddes is interested in how to help children express them and to develop them. I think the other thing that's worth bearing in mind here is that while I'm focusing on youth and particularly on children just now, for Geddes, the idea of youth is not necessarily limited to a particular age, and he's very much building on Stanley Hall's ideas here. In his essay on Stanley Hall, view of Stanley Hall, he writes, well, he quotes Stanley Hall saying, the best definition of genius is intensified and prolonged adolescence. And Geddes very much shared this idea of maintaining that sort of initial form of childhood, or that sense of adolescence into adult life, how to sustain these curiosities that children and adolescents have. So that gives us an introduction to Geddes and his involvement in this sort of growing youth or child movement and child study at the time. And it sits alongside, interestingly, other movements that are occurring around this period that are much more connected or closely connected to cultural nationalism. And those are the youth movements of Young Ireland, Young Belgium, Young Poland, that are focusing on how but they're young groups of writers and intellectuals and thinkers who are trying to defend their culture and to embody forms of cultural revival, although they all take very different forms. And in some ways, there is an equivalent of that happening in Scotland, quite explicitly so. One aspect of it, politically, is the Young Scots Society, which was formed in 1900 after a big Liberal defeat in the general election. And the Young Scots were groups of liberals who were sort of thinking about how do we reanimate and re-strengthen the party. And they had various different issues that they were concerned with, but increasingly over the course of, well, up until about 1906, 1907, they became very much focused on Scottish Home Rule. Interestingly, Geddes presented at the Dunfermline Young Scots Society. He was meant to chair a lecture on heredity and social progress, but the lecturer, Stanton Colt, couldn't make it due to illness, so Geddes just decided that he'd give his own lecture on heredity and social progress. And in his archives as well, Geddes kept one of the pamphlets of the Young Scots Society titled 60 Points for Scottish Home Rule. So that gives us a sense of the sort of political aspect of Young Scotland, but actually there is a cultural side to it as well, and that's something that Geddes is very much at the heart of, which Murdo has sort of introduced us to already with the Scots Renaissance. The only reference that I've found explicitly to the idea of a Young Scotland is William Sharp, who of course Elsa's introduced us to in the first talk. In one of his letters to Edmund Clarence Stedman, he specifically links the Evergreen to this idea of Young Scotland. He writes, "Tell Mrs. Stedman that the copy of the Evergreen I shall send in a fortnight or so is really for her. It's a beautiful production in its format, and she is to keep it in her drawing room for a little and show it to her literary friends as the organ of Young Scotland." And tied to that, Megan Ferguson has very accurately noted the fact that Geddes is trying to create a community of young scholars, young thinkers, young artists and writers around him to sort of add fuel to this Edinburgh Celtic revival. It is very much a young movement, which is partly why William Sharp is attributing that expression, young Scotland, to the Evergreen. I suppose one of the things that I'm trying to think through here is, are these two phenomena that Geddes is involved in, this sort of emergence of a young Scotland cultural movement, a Scottish revival, and his interest in child study, do they intersect in any way? And I think the answer is yes, on quite a few grounds. I think we see it when we turn to the Evergreen. The Evergreen, of course, is a sort of mad magazine in a sense. It brings together lots of different types of contributions. So we get sociological essays, scientific essays, we get quite extended discussions on artistic debates, for instance, on decadence in the period. And of course, there's lots of illustrations that owe a debt to Aubrey Beardsley. But alongside all of those contributions, we also get a lot of material that seems to be aimed at children or at young people, or at least is sort of making references out to that community. We see it, of course, with Charles Mackey's illustration here, when the girls come out to play. We also see it in The Carol of Youth by Hugo Laubach, and also in The Crows, a Child Poem by Gabrielle Seaton. And I think this concern with youth that we get in the Evergreen is also quite clearly voiced in the Scots Renaissance itself. So I'll just go through a couple of quotes here that again demonstrate the fact that although Geddes is starting off with John Stuart Blackie, starting on with the death of Blackie and of Blackie and Stevenson, there is a concern with youth and emergence in that essay. So one of the first quotes that we get from the Scottish Renaissance is where Geddes writes, "Though age pass away at evening and manhood be reft from us at noon, new dawn ever comes, and with it new youth." So it's this sort of sense in tune with the seasonal nature of the Evergreen, that something passes and something rises, something is emergent that comes from it. And that's part of what's happening with his depiction of the funerals of Blackie and Stevenson. He's seeing them falling, but as Murdo said, there is that continuation of their ideas which can rise up in a new generation. We also see the hope that Geddes has that the Evergreen is going to stimulate future writers. And this comes through when he's discussing Alan Ramsay's Evergreen, as well as Scott. So he writes that Alan Ramsay's Evergreen helped to urge succeeding writers to higher issues, among which even Percy's Relics and Scott's Border Minstrelsy are reckoned. So our new Evergreen may here and there stimulate some new and younger writer. So there's this hope that a sort of equivalent of Scott could emerge from the Evergreen and its community. Towards the end of the Scottish Renaissance, we also get a focus on children and on teaching. And that is the moment where Geddes discusses Grahamston, the town just outside Falkirk. And what he's interested in there is the military hero of Grahamston, and he wants teachers to go to his tomb and to the stones at his tomb, and to sort of arouse their sense of hero worship, I suppose, in both Wallace, who Graham fought alongside, and also Blind Harry. So he writes, "And so in some young soul here and there, the spirit of the hero and the poet Wallace and Blind Harry may awaken." He's imagining the teacher here reading out Blind Harry's Wallace to the pupils, and for them to get this sort of awakening through that process. And that stress on education that we see there, and how education could play a role in the Scottish revival, is evident in quite a lot of Geddes's different initiatives. So one of the things he was very supportive of was the idea of scholars, students, and even potentially children going out into the world and touring around Europe and potentially further afield in order to get their education. He writes that a new generation is growing up accustomed from its youth to rapid and independent touring, donning a new conception of education that's no longer primarily based on the tradition of the book, but on actual personal knowledge of the world. And in the second quote here, we see how that enthusiasm he has, how it can directly link into Scottish cultural revivalism. He writes, here we are fortunately able to utilise those wide and varied personal relations which many of us have made abroad with the many colleagues and guests of our annual summer meeting, which was held in Edinburgh, where the most varied schools of thought are represented. The Scottish student is again beginning to wander as of old, and the readers of Hilburton's Scott Abroad, for whom the ancient league with France may seem an old and half-forgotten story, will soon hear of the Société Franco-Écossaise. So what Geddes is suggesting here is that through these sort of international trips that students might make, that is how they're going to build up these old continental sympathies with Europe. He's very keen to develop, and as he states in the Evergreen, he sees that as underpinning the Scots Renaissance. And it's linked into what Murdo was saying, that while being both national is also looking out to the wider world. Alongside his support for touring, he's also very supportive of pageantry, historical pageantry. So pageants were these sort of processional events of historical eras or particular events in which large crowds would gather to watch. And Geddes said that these were key to remusing youth. In his essay on the significance and purpose of the masks or the pageants, they mean the same thing. To remuse youth and the people, that is the problem. Here at length, we come to the central problem and significance of our masks, their inmost aim and outward endeavour, to re-establish a common culture, civic, national and general. How to aid this improvement at all levels has long been a main activity of the Outlook Tower. But of all these endeavours, the maskers is the most ambitious and comprehensive. So he's really seeing pageantry as one of the key activities that he's engaged with in the 20th century to help remuse the youth and society more broadly. He also sees pageantry as being key to nurturing a sense of folklore and to challenging centralisation, sort of linking into some of the ideas that Elsa was saying earlier. And the quote at the bottom is Victor Branford saying something quite similar, I suppose, commenting on the latent possibilities of dramatised education. It's unsurprising that Geddes wanted his children to be part of national pageants. Indeed, his wife was involved in, Anna Geddes, she was involved in setting up the Celtic costumes for the Scottish national pageant. And here we see two of his children. We see Arthur and Alistair. Arthur is Harper to Finn, and Alistair as Rider to the She. I tried to find a picture of Nora, who played Niamh, but I couldn't find a photograph of her, unfortunately. But more broadly, Geddes advocated a revival of Celtic dress, especially for their boys and girls. That's actually him saying that himself. And this was a sort of important facet of it for Geddes, that it wasn't just for children to watch these spectacles of history, but to participate in them as well. He believed that through that dramatising of history, that's how they could learn about it better. It was much better to perform a historical figure than to read about in a book that would aid education to do it that way. And following on from the Scottish National Pageant, Geddes then constructed his own mask, which is the Mask of Ancient, Medieval and Modern Learning. And what's interesting about that particular pageant is that it starts off with a school child who is sort of centred, and the school child comes in with school bag on and all of its books, and then a professor comes down, most likely modelled on Geddes, looks at the school bag and says, oh, this is ridiculous, you're never going to learn anything with these books. What's better for you is if you are taken under the spell of the pageant. And then the boy witnesses the pageant, which is a huge pageant that covers everything from education right at the beginnings of times up into more modern times. And it said at the end, our schoolboy, now a student citizen, as later in life he will be a citizen student, as torchbearer leading the way, with a child also perpetual symbol of the future. So I think I'm actually just wondering about time, because I want to kind of think about the Scots Renaissance. So I might pass over this, but I think the only thing to highlight here is just the fact that Geddes is clearly embracing forms of popular culture here through his support of pageantry, and also, as we see in the Scots Renaissance and the megalithic builders, his support of Kailyard writing and his support of Stevenson. And that, I suppose, is quite a marked difference that we get in terms of some of the later Scottish Renaissance writers, which David Goldie was commenting on in one of our previous sessions, in the sense that they often distance themselves from popular culture and saw the Scottish Renaissance as a more elite form. And yet the other, Stevenson and Fabiana Squares, just to point out that this is a much broader interest in childhood in Scotland at this time. So in terms of the Scottish Renaissance in youth, yeah, I'm trying to work out whether there's continuity here with Geddes or whether there's a rupture with Geddes. Because on the one hand, we do find in Scottish Renaissance writing that there is a real identification with youth, that lots of Scottish Renaissance writers style themselves as young writers and part of a young movement. We see that in David Cleghorn Thompson's book, Scotland, Quest for Youth. George Blake stated that we are very young, very ambitious. Naomi Mitchison said that Scotland must learn not to be ashamed of its own youth and vigour. And like William Sharp, Hugh McDiarmid applauded the young Belgian writers. So in that sense, there is something similar in that trying to style themselves as a young movement and to tap into their youth and vigour. But at the same time, and we've seen this in previous workshops for this network, particularly in thinking of Glenda Norquay's presentation on Stevenson, where later Renaissance writers are often looking back on the writers of the 1890s, for instance, and sort of being quite condescending in the way that they see those writers as being immature or as being too kind of childish. We see that with the two quotations of Stevenson in the middle here, but then also William Sharp was described by Hugh McDiarmid as having a passionate prematurity, and Lewis Spence commented on the 19th century as being the most jeune period in Scottish letters, again suggesting there was a sort of naivety. So yeah, I'm trying to work out, I suppose, here, if this does mark a sort of break in a sense, or if the case is that the later Renaissance writers, looking back, are just not quite tapping into the fact that for Geddes and for other figures, that they see childhood and youth as an integral part of the Scottish revival, and they're trying to draw from that sort of culture of youth and child study and to integrate it into their ideas about revival. And maybe that's something that the Scottish Renaissance is just overlooked when it's sort of condescendingly associating it with immaturity and youth. Okay, but I shall leave it there. And yeah, thank you for listening.